The story of the homeless man. He tells how he protects himself from the cold. A moving story. Asterisk, the bitter wind cut through downtown Minneapolis like a knife, and James Parker knew that tonight would be one of the coldest he'd faced in his 2 years living on the streets. At 58 years old, with weathered hands and a face lined by countless nights under the open sky, James had become an expert in something no one should have to master: surviving winter without a home. As he sat in the doorway of a closed shop, wrapping himself in layers of newspaper and cardboard, he began to share the hard-won wisdom that had kept him alive through temperatures that had claimed the lives of others. People think being homeless in winter is just about being cold, James said, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. But it's so much more than that. It's about strategy, about knowing your body, about understanding that every decision you make could be the difference between waking up tomorrow and not waking up at all. James pulled his worn wool coat tighter around his shoulders, a coat that had been his constant companion since he'd found it abandoned in a charity donation bin 3 winters ago. It was too big for him now. Homelessness had cost him 40 pounds, but its oversized nature had become an advantage, allowing him to layer clothing underneath and create pockets of warm air that had saved his life countless times. The first winter nearly killed me, James continued, his voice steady despite the chattering of his teeth. I thought I knew what cold was. I'd been camping. I'd worked construction in Minnesota winters. I'd shoveled snow for 20 years. But when you don't have a warm place to go back to, when you can't just turn up a thermostat or climb into a heated car, cold becomes your enemy in ways you never imagined. The irony wasn't lost on James that he was sharing this story just blocks away from the construction site where he'd once worked as a crane operator, earning enough to support his family and heat a comfortable home. A workplace injury, followed by addiction to prescription painkillers, followed by the loss of his job. And insurance had led him to this doorway where he now taught survival lessons that no human being should have to learn. The cold doesn't just attack your body, James explained, methodically arranging newspapers inside his coat. It attacks your mind, your spirit, your will to keep going. When you're shivering so hard you can't think straight, when your fingers are too numb to open a can of food, when you're so tired from fighting the cold that you just want to lie down and sleep forever, that's when the cold wins. That's when people don't wake up. James had developed a complex system for surviving the cold that he'd learned through trial, error, and the hard-won wisdom of other homeless individuals who had become his teachers in this harsh education. His first lesson was about layering, but not in the way most people understood it. You can't just pile on clothes, James explained, demonstrating with the multiple layers he wore. If you do it wrong, you'll sweat, and sweat will kill you faster than no clothes at all. You need to create air pockets, trap warm air, and be able to adjust your layers quickly when your body temperature changes. James showed how he wore a thin cotton t-shirt as a base layer, followed by a long-sleeved shirt, then a sweater, then his coat. But the real innovation was what he did with newspaper and cardboard. He had learned to create insulation layers by stuffing newspaper between his clothes, paying special attention to his torso where vital organs needed the most protection. Your core temperature is everything, James said, pointing to his chest. You can lose fingers and toes, and still leave. You can't lose your heart or your lungs. So everything I do is about keeping my core warm, even if it means my hands and feet get cold. James had also learned the crucial importance of keeping his feet dry and warm. He showed his companions, other homeless individuals who had gathered to hear his survival wisdom, how he wrapped his feet in plastic bags before putting on socks, creating a waterproof barrier that prevented moisture from getting in. Over that, he wore multiple pairs of socks, and then boots that were 2 sizes too big to accommodate the extra layers. Frostbite starts in your extremities, James explained. Once it sets in, it's almost impossible to reverse without medical care, and most of us don't have access to medical care. I've seen people lose toes, lose fingers, because they didn't understand how to protect their extremities. The most difficult part of James's cold weather survival strategy was finding safe places to sleep. Public buildings closed at night, most. Businesses didn't allow loitering, and sleeping outdoors in sub-zero temperatures was often a death sentence. James had become an expert in finding what he called micro-shelters, small, protected spaces that could provide just enough warmth to survive the night. Heat rises, James said, pointing to the grates in the sidewalk. Those subway grates. Heating vents from buildings, exhaust from restaurants. They put out warm air that can mean the difference between life and death. But you have to be smart about it. You can't block the vent. You can't make it obvious what you're doing. And you have to be ready to move if security comes. James had also learned to recognize the signs of hypothermia in himself and others. He could identify the stages. First the shivering, then the confusion, then the dangerous euphoria that made people think they were warm when they were actually dying. The psychological warfare of surviving cold homelessness was something James had learned to master through sheer necessity. The mental strategies he developed were as important as the physical ones, because the cold attacked not just the body, but the will to survive. The hardest part isn't the physical cold, James said, his voice growing quieter. It's the mental cold. It's lying there shivering, knowing that other people are warm in their beds, knowing that you used to be one of those people. It's the desperation that creeps in when you realize you're fighting for your life every single night. James had learned to use meditation and mental techniques to manage the psychological stress of extreme cold. He would focus on memories of warmth, summer days from his childhood, the feeling of holding his daughter when she was a baby, the satisfaction of a hot meal after a long day of work. These mental warm places helped him endure the physical reality of his situation. I create heat with my mind, James explained. I know it sounds crazy, but when you're lying there shivering, you can actually raise your body temperature by concentrating on warmth. I think about being in a warm bathtub, or sitting by a fireplace, or holding a cup of hot coffee. It doesn't eliminate the cold, but it makes it bearable. James had also learned the importance of staying active during the day to generate body heat and maintain circulation. He would walk for hours, not just because he had nowhere else to go, but because movement was crucial for surviving the cold. He had developed a routine of exercises he could do even in small spaces, jumping jacks, push-ups, stretching, to keep his blood flowing and his body temperature up. Movement is life when you're homeless in winter, James said, demonstrating. Some of the exercises he did. If you just sit still and try to conserve energy, you'll die. You have to keep moving, keep your blood circulating, keep your body fighting. Even when you're exhausted, even when you just want to curl up and sleep, you have to keep moving. The community aspect of surviving cold homelessness was something James had learned to navigate carefully. Other homeless individuals could be allies in the fight against cold, sharing body heat, resources, and survival strategies. But they could also be dangerous competitors for limited warm spaces and resources. There's an unwritten code among people who live on the streets, James explained. We share information about warm places. We look out for each other when someone's showing signs of hypothermia. We share resources when we can, but we also have to be careful. Desperation makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. James had formed alliances with other homeless individuals, creating informal networks that helped everyone survive. They would take turns staying awake to watch for danger, share body heat when necessary, and pool their resources to afford occasional nights in cheap motels when the temperature dropped to life-threatening levels. James had learned to read the weather like a survival expert, understanding that his life depended on accurately predicting temperature changes, storms, and wind patterns. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when dangerous weather was approaching, allowing him to prepare and find better shelter before conditions became life-threatening. Most people check the weather to decide what to wear. James said, pulling a crumpled piece of newspaper from his pocket with weather forecasts carefully marked. I check the weather to decide whether I'll live or die tonight. When they predict temperatures below 20 degrees, I know I need to find emergency shelter or risk dying in my sleep. James had mapped out every warm public space in the city, creating a mental catalog of places where he could warm up during the day. Libraries, shopping malls, fast food restaurants, hospital waiting rooms. Any place with heat and public access became a crucial resource in his survival strategy. He had learned the schedules of security guards, the patience levels of different business owners, and the unwritten rules of each location. The key is not to overstay your welcome, James explained. If you're respectful, if you don't cause problems, if you buy something occasionally when you have money, most places will tolerate you for a few hours. But if you push it, if you make them uncomfortable, they'll ban you, and you'll lose a place that could save your life. James had also learned to scavenge for materials that could help him survive the cold. He knew which dumpsters behind restaurants might contain cardboard boxes perfect for insulation, which construction sites might have discarded materials useful for building wind barriers, and which businesses threw away newspapers that could be used for warmth. Everything becomes a potential resource when you're fighting for your life, James said, showing how he had reinforced his shoes with duct tape and cardboard to prevent heat loss through his feet. That piece of plastic wrap, that old towel, that newspaper, they're not trash when you're homeless. They're survival tools. The medical aspects of surviving extreme cold had become crucial knowledge for James. He had learned to recognize and treat the early stages of frostbite, to understand the symptoms of hypothermia, and to know when he needed to seek emergency medical care. He had also learned which over-the-counter medications could help with circulation and which ones were dangerous when combined with alcohol. I've seen people die from the cold, James said, his voice heavy with the weight of those memories. Good. People, smart people, people who are just in the wrong place during the wrong weather. I've learned that there's no shame in going to the emergency room when you're in danger. The hospital has to treat you, and sometimes that emergency room visit is the only thing standing between you and death. James had developed relationships with social workers, shelter staff, and medical professionals who understood the realities of homelessness. These relationships had become crucial resources, providing access to emergency shelter, medical care, and survival supplies when weather conditions became extreme. The hardest lesson James had learned was when to abandon pride and dignity in favor of survival. He had been forced to do things that the person he used to be would have found humiliating, but he had learned that death was more humiliating than any temporary loss of dignity. I've slept in public bathrooms when the temperature dropped below zero, James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I've asked strangers for money to buy a cup of coffee just so I could sit in a warm restaurant for an hour. I've pretended to be interested in buying things at stores just so I could walk around in the heat. These aren't things I'm proud of, but they're things that kept me alive. James had learned to swallow his pride and accept help when it was offered. Early in his homelessness, he had refused assistance, believing he could handle his situation alone. But surviving winter had taught him that independence was a luxury he couldn't afford when his life was at stake. People offer help for different reasons, James explained. Some genuinely want to help. Some want to feel good about themselves. Some want to ease their own guilt about having more than you do. I've learned to accept help regardless of the motivation behind it, because when you're fighting hypothermia, The reason someone gives you a blanket doesn't matter. The blanket matters. James had also learned to prepare for winter during the warmer months, understanding that surviving cold homelessness required year-round planning. He would spend summer months collecting warm clothing, identifying potential shelter locations, and building relationships with people who might help him when winter arrived. Summer is when you prepare for winter, James said. You collect every piece of warm clothing you can find. You scout out warm places to sleep. You build relationships with people who might help you when the cold comes. If you wait until winter to start preparing, you're already dead. The mental preparation for winter was as important as the physical preparation. James had learned to accept that he would be cold, hungry, and uncomfortable for months, but that these conditions were temporary and survivable if he remained focused and disciplined. You can't fight winter, James said. You can't get angry at it. You can't wish it away. You can't pretend it's not happening. You have to accept that it's going to be hell, and then you have to do whatever it takes to survive that hell. Every night you wake up alive is a victory. James had learned that surviving cold homelessness required him to become a different person than he had been before. The man who had worked construction, owned a home, and provided for his family had to learn skills and develop instincts that civilized society had never required of him. 3 years after his first winter on the streets, James had become something of a legend among the homeless community. People sought him out for advice, for survival tips, for the wisdom that had kept him alive when others had died. He had transformed from a victim of circumstances into a teacher, a guide, and a symbol of human resilience. I never wanted to become an expert in surviving homelessness, James said, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. But since I did, I feel responsible for sharing what I learned. If my knowledge can keep one person alive through one cold night, then maybe all of this suffering meant something. James had connected with local organizations that provided services to homeless individuals, becoming an advocate for better winter shelters, more emergency warming centers, and improved access to survival resources. His first-hand experience had made him a valuable voice in policy discussions about homelessness and cold weather survival. The people making decisions about homeless services often have no idea what it's actually like to sleep outside in 20 below weather. James explained, they create policies based on what they think we need, not what we actually need. I try to bridge that gap to help them understand the reality we face. James had also become a mentor to newly homeless individuals, teaching them the survival skills he had learned through trial and error. He had developed an informal curriculum of cold weather survival, passing on knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for someone facing their first winter on the streets. I meet people who are just starting their journey into homelessness, James said. They're scared, they're unprepared, they don't know what they're facing. I try to give them the tools they need to survive, the knowledge that took me years to learn through suffering. The irony of James's situation wasn't lost on him. He had become an expert in something he never wanted to learn, a teacher of skills that no one should have to acquire. But he had also found purpose in his suffering, meaning in his survival, and dignity in his ability to help others. I'm not proud of being homeless, James said. I'm not proud of having to sleep in doorways and fight for my life every winter night. But I am proud of surviving. I'm proud of learning. I'm proud of being strong enough to help others who are going through what I went through. James had recently been offered a job with a local homeless services organization, using his expertise to help design better winter survival programs. The position would provide him with housing, income, and the chance to make a systemic difference in how society addresses cold weather homelessness. I'm ready to come in from the cold, James said with a smile. Not just physically, but emotionally. I've learned everything I need to know about surviving winter homelessness. Now I want to use that knowledge to help others, to change systems, to make sure that fewer people have to go through what I went through. As James prepared for what might be his last winter on the streets, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had lost a home, a job, and a family, but he had found something else, an understanding of human resilience, the power of community, and the strength that comes from surviving the unsurvivable. If someone had told me 5 years ago that I would survive 3 winters on the streets of Minneapolis, I would have said it was impossible, James concluded. If someone had told me that I would become a teacher, a mentor, an advocate because of that experience, I would have said it was impossible too. I've learned that human beings are capable of adapting to anything, surviving anything, and finding meaning in the most difficult circumstances. If this story moved you and reminded you of the incredible resilience of the human spirit, of the importance of community support, and of the dignity that exists in every person regardless of their circumstances, then please subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week, real accounts of survival, strength, and the extraordinary ways people adapt to life's most challenging circumstances. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that believes in the power of human resilience and the importance of never giving up hope.